I endured the human warfront, and it was worse than hell, the first sound I heard. When I landed on Earth's forward staging ground was laughter, not nervous. Laughter not the kind that breaks out of a mouth because fear has nowhere else to go, deep, real belly shaking. Laughter coming from a cluster of young humans sitting on top of a supply crate. 40 m from my landing pad, one of them was holding something small and orange and eating it with great enthusiasm. Another was telling a story with his hands moving in wide circles, and the others were losing themselves completely. At whatever he was saying, I stood there with my documentation case in one hand and my union credentials in the other, and I watched them for a moment longer than was professionally appropriate. My name is Vorthus. I serve the Galactic Union's War Documentation Corps, a body that has been recording, analyzing, and classifying armed conflict across the known galaxy for 4,000 years. I have personally covered 19 wars. I have documented the fall of the Sirith Empire, the Caith first purge of the lowland colonies, the silent siege of Marith Prime. I have stood in the aftermath of things that would collapse lesser minds, and I have written clean, precise reports about all of it. I was sent to observe humanity's defensive campaign against the Caith Dominion because the Union's Senior Council wanted an impartial record. The Caith had pressed a full assault into human-controlled space 7 weeks earlier, and the campaign had not gone the way anyone predicted. Not the Caith, who had never encountered a species that refused to yield forward territory even when the tactical math clearly said to yield it. Not the Union, whose initial projections had humanity collapsing within 3 weeks. And not me, who had reviewed every scrap of available intelligence before departure and filed a quiet preliminary opinion that the humans were being somewhat brave but ultimately unwise. I arrived at staging base Iridium on the northern edge of the Vasquez system with a full expectation that I would be documenting the final organized phase of a species' military defeat. I expected to see a tired army. I expected to see commanders who had accepted the inevitable and were simply managing retreat. I expected the particular kind of exhausted silence that settles over a fighting force that has been pushed past its reasonable limits. I did not expect the laughter. The human who met me at the pad was a corporal named De Jong. He was not especially tall, not especially broad, and he was carrying a rifle in a way that suggested it was simply part of his body at this point. Like an arm or a shoulder, he looked at my documentation case, then at me, then back at the case, and he said, "Long trip." I told him it was 14 hours by standard transit. He nodded like this was useful information and said, "There's food in the forward bay if you want it." Real food? Well, sort of real. Then he picked up one of my cases and started walking, and I had no choice but to follow. The base was not what I expected. I had visited military staging grounds across 11 species, and there was a particular feeling to them. Compressed, careful energy, everyone moving with purpose and economy, voices low, no excess motion. Iridium had that in places, but it also had corners of noise and warmth that I kept looking at. Too long, a group of humans arguing loudly about something called the best approach to a ridgeline while pointing at a hand-drawn map on a food container. 2 medics playing a game with small, flat cards while their gear charged on the rack beside them. Someone had hung Small colored lights around the entrance to the main communications bay, and I stopped and stared at them for 3 full seconds because I genuinely could not classify their tactical purpose. Day. Zhang noticed someone's birthday, he said without breaking stride. Corporal Nina Webb, she's 23 today. I noted this in my documentation log under the heading non-standard base decoration. Purpose unknown, possible morale. Function, Commander Yesenia Caldas received me in the operations center with the kind of efficiency I expected. From a senior officer, she was a compact woman with dark, attentive eyes and the voice of someone who had long since stopped wasting words. She shook my hand, which is a human greeting custom I was familiar with but still found somewhat startling in practice, and she told me without ceremony exactly what my access would and would not include. I asked her about current force composition. She handed me a physical document. I scanned it and then read it again because I thought I had misunderstood. These are not professional soldiers, I said. Some are, she replied. The rest are people who signed up when the Keth pushed into the colonies. We've got a former agricultural technician running second squad, a secondary school teacher on comms, and our best forward observer is 19 years old and was studying music. Before all this started, I looked at the document a 3rd time. I said carefully, Commander, the Keth Dominion fields warriors bred and trained from early growth stages for the single purpose of organized assault. Their junior units have more combined combat hours than most species' senior forces. Your frontline composition, with respect, does not appear to account for this gap. Coldest looked at me for a moment, then she said, walk the base tonight, observer, talk to them, then come back and tell me what you think we're missing. I did walk the base that night. I spent before hours moving through the different sections and talking to whoever would speak to me. I talked to the agricultural technician, whose name was Owen, and who explained defensive grid positioning to me with the same calm clarity he probably used to explain crop irrigation. I talked to a young woman named Petra, who told me she had not spoken to her family in 6 weeks and that she thought about them every day, and that thinking about them was what kept her form getting slow. I talked to a man named Calvin, who had been a postal worker and who was now responsible for a section of the perimeter, and when I asked him why he had volunteered, he looked at me like the question was slightly strange and said, because someone had to. I returned to my assigned quarters and sat for a long time without writing anything. The Keth assault report came in at 400 hours, not a probe, a full advanced armored columns on 2 flanks. Aerial suppression units confirmed. Estimated contact in 3 hours. I reached immediately for my evacuation protocol documentation, the standard procedure maintained in every field assignment, the forms that would classify me as a non-combatant observer and ensure my extraction before frontline contact. De Jong appeared in my doorway. He was dressed and armed and eating something wrapped in foil. He held out a dull gray helmet and said, "You'll need this." I took the helmet. I do not know entirely why. Perhaps it was the way he said it, without any particular drama, like offering someone an umbrella because rain was coming. I put it on my head and followed him, and I told myself it was because proper documentation required proximity to events. I told myself that for the next 18 hours I told myself that right up until the moment the first Keth column emerged from the tree line in perfect terrifying formation, and the human soldiers around me did not run, did not freeze, did not break into the controlled retreat the tactical model said they should execute. They dug in, and then things began that I did not have any framework to understand. The Keth advanced in the way they always advanced. I had studied their assault doctrine extensively before the assignment. It was precise, it was overwhelming, and it was designed around a single core principle that had held true across every engagement in their history. Sustained pressure eventually produces collapse. You do not need to destroy a defending force, you only need to make them believe the cost of staying is higher than the cost of leaving. The Keth had ended more wars with that single idea than with any weapon in their arsenal. For the first 20 minutes, it looked like it was working. The Keth suppression units laid down covering fire across the forward edge of the human position with the kind of coordination that almost looked like machinery. Every burst calculated, every advance measured, the whole thing moving like water finding the lowest point. On my scanner, the energy signatures of 3 human forward positions went cold as the crews inside pulled back to the secondary line. The tactical picture looked exactly like the beginning of the end. Then something happened that I could not immediately classify. A human soldier in the second defensive trench discovered that the drainage canal running along the base of the eastern slope connected underground to a maintenance tunnel that opened up behind the left flank of the advancing Keth column. He did not report this up the chain of command and wait for authorization. He told the 4 people closest to him. They grabbed what they could carry and they moved through that tunnel while the Keth were still calculating the front line resistance. They came up behind the column and they hit it from a direction that was not in any Keth formation model, because no Keth formation model included drainage canals. The column did not break. Keth columns do not break, but they stopped advancing for 4 minutes while they reoriented, and in those 4 minutes, Commander Caldes pushed reinforcements into the gap on the right flank that the column had been carving open. I was watching through the observation feed, and I wrote in my log, improvised flanking maneuver via non-tactical infrastructure, not in the human defense plan. Spontaneous. I stared at what I had written and added effective. That was the first thing I could not explain. There were many more. The supply drone situation was the second. One of the human aerial resupply drones had taken a hit on its navigation system and was circling in a useless loop over the main compound, broadcasting a steady key signal that the Keth targeting system was almost certainly tracking. The drone operator, a young man named Gareth who could not have been older than 20, pulled the drone out of its loop, jammed it to full speed, and flew it directly at the Keth forward command position, not as a weapon, as a distraction. He broadcast the drone's original supply run frequency on an open channel as it went, and 3 Keth targeting units redirected toward it for 68 seconds, believing it was an incoming tactical asset. 68 seconds. Keth used every one of them. I wrote in my log, repurposed malfunctioning equipment as a tactical decoy. 0 cost, high return. Filed under human improvisation pattern. Instance 2. By midday I had filed 11 such instances, By nightfall I had stopped counting. What stayed with me most from that first day was not the clever maneuvers or the stubborn defense. It was something I saw in the third hour during the heaviest part of the eighth push on the central line. A soldier named Harper was positioned at a corner of the eastern trench when the eighth suppression shifted and caught his position directly. His comms went out. The soldiers around him went down, not dead but pinned, unable to move. He was, by any reasonable tactical assessment, in a position from which there was no good outcome. The eighth forward squad was 40 m away and closing. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached his corner. What happened next is the thing I have written and rewritten in my notes more times than any other single observation in 19 wars. He stood up. He did not retreat. He did not signal surrender. He stood up in the open, took a breath that I could see from the feed was not steady, and he charged forward, shouting at the top of his lungs with a sound that was not tactical or measured or calculated. Anyway, it was raw and human, and it filled the channel completely. The eighth forward squad stopped, not for long, 2.3 seconds according to my recorders timestamp, but they stopped. Something in that sound, in that movement, in the absolute disregard for reasonable behavior paused the calculation that eighth soldiers were always running, and in those 2.3 seconds, 3 other human soldiers who had been pinned were suddenly no longer pinned. The corner held. I wrote in my log, charging behavior observed under conditions of near certain negative outcome, tactical effect positive, mechanism unknown. Recommend further study. I sat looking at those words for a long time. The Keth are not afraid of soldiers. They have fought thousands of them across hundreds of species. They know soldiers. They understand soldiers. What they are not built to process is something that does not behave like a soldier at all, something that looks at a situation with no good options and simply refuses to accept that those are the only options. When darkness finally came and the Keth pulled back to consolidate, the human position had held, not comfortably, not without cost. The casualty numbers in the evening report were ones I made myself look at directly rather than summarizing, because I felt that was what they deserved. But the line existed, the base still stood, and by every predictive model I had run through my analysis system during the day, it should not have. I sat in my quarters and opened my preliminary report to the Union. I had filed the initial version 3 days before arrival, before I had seen any of this. I had written with confidence that humanity's defensive campaign showed a species performing admirably under conditions beyond their experience, but that the fundamental asymmetry of the engagement would produce a predictable outcome within 8 to 12 weeks. I selected the entire document. I looked at it for a moment. I deleted it. The soldiers held something that night, a loose, informal gathering around a fuel drum. Someone had converted into a heat source. I was going to walk past it. I told myself I had notes to organize and a new preliminary report to begin, but I stopped and I stood at the edge of the firelight for a while and I watched. They talked about the people they had lost that day. They'd said their names out loud. One woman, whose name I later learned was Fiona, talked about a man called Derek who had been in her unit since the beginning, and she described a specific thing he used to do when he thought no one was watching. A small habit involving the way he folded, ration packaging, and the people around. Her laughed quietly at this memory, and she laughed too, even though her eyes were wet. Then someone made a joke about the food, and someone else made a worse joke in response, and the laughter that came was different from the first kind, lighter and brighter, and it spread around the fuel drum like heat. Then they slept. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark outside my quarters, and I looked at the stars, and I opened a new document in my recorder, and I wrote, "Initial assessment requires significant correction. The following variables were not properly weighted in the original model." I stopped there. I did not know yet what to put in the list. I was not yet sure I had the right words for what I had seen, but I knew this much. Whatever framework I had brought with me to this war was not large enough to hold what was actually happening here. I would need a bigger one. 3 weeks into the campaign, I stopped thinking of what I was doing as documentation. Documentation implies distance. It implies a clean line between the observer and the observed. You watch, you record, you file, and you walk away with your notes and your instruments and your professional detachment intact. I had maintained that line in 19 wars. I believed it was the right way to do the job. I believed the line was important. 3 weeks into the human war front, the line was gone. I did not notice exactly when it disappeared. I know it was still there on the 4th day when I filed my second, revised preliminary report to the Union and used language like anomalous behavioral persistence and statistically improbable defensive cohesion to describe what I was watching. Clinical words, safe words, words that kept the thing at arm's length. By the end of the 2nd week, I was using different words in my private log, words like remarkable, words like I do not understand this, and I am not sure I am supposed to. By the 3rd week, I had stopped writing 2 separate logs. There was only the one, and it contained both the data and the feeling, because I had lost the ability to sort them into different columns. The collapsed industrial sector of what had once been the urban center of Vasquez City was where things changed most deeply for me. The Keth had pushed hard from the north and taken the upper half of the grid. The human forces held the lower half. The old factory district, a maze of thick walls and deep basements and access tunnels that the humans used with a familiarity that the Keth could not match. Every surface in that district had a human name on it, not military designations, actual names. Harper's Corner, where Harper had made his famous stand in the 1st week. Nina's Alley, named for the corporal whose birthday lights I had seen on my first night. The humans had named every part of the world they were defending, and in doing so, they had made it personal in a way that I found difficult quantify. I began to conduct interviews during the quiet periods, unofficial ones not formatted for the Union report. I simply sat down near people and asked questions and wrote what they told me. I asked a soldier named Calvin, the former postal worker, what he thought about during a quiet moment. He thought about it seriously. He said, "My brother's kids, I've got 2 nephews, 6 and 8. I think about what they're going to be like when they're grown, whether they'll be funny, whether they'll be the kind of people who stop to help someone who's dropped their groceries." He paused. I've never met anyone who stopped for something like that and turned out to be a bad person, so I want them to be the kind who stops. I Wrote this down exactly as he said it. I had no framework to file it under. I asked Petra, the young woman who thought about her family, what she was most afraid of. She did not say the Keth. She said being the kind of person who stops trying. She said it without drama, the way you say something you have already made peace with. I've seen people get to a point where they just stop. Their eyes go flat and it never comes back. That thing behind the eyes, that's the thing I'm afraid of losing. I asked her how she kept it from happening. She looked at me like the answer was simple. You keep doing the next thing, she said. You don't think about the whole thing. You just do the next thing, and you pay attention to the people next to you, because they're doing the same. I wrote, keep doing the next thing. I underlined it. Then I sat with it for a long time. What I was learning, slowly and against my professional instincts, was that human resilience was not a single thing. It was not toughness in the way I had always understood toughness. Hardening, a closing off of the parts that could feel pain. It was something stranger and more complicated. Humans felt everything. They felt it fully, loudly, openly. They talked about the people they had lost. They laughed at things that were not funny enough to deserve laughter in any reasonable accounting. They got angry over small things and then let the anger go and moved on, and somehow, impossibly, feeling all of that did not weaken them. It seemed to do the opposite. De Jong told me something that clarified this better than any interview. It was the 19th day and he had taken a hit to his side from a piece of shrapnel during a Keth probe of the southern perimeter. It was a real wound, deep enough that any species in the Union's medical database would have classified it as requiring evacuation and recovery. The medic, a sharp-eyed woman named Lena, cleaned it and sealed it and told him to rest. He rested for 4 hours, then he got up, ate something, and walked back to his post. I followed him. I said, Corporal, you were told to rest. He looked at me with calm, tired eyes, not stubborn eyes, not aggressive eyes. Calm, he said. They need a warm body on that corner. I'm a warm body. That was all. Not bravery performed for an audience, not a declaration, a simple accounting of what was needed and what was available. He turned and walked to the corner and stood there and did his job. I stood watching him for a moment. Then I went back to my quarters and I sat on the edge of my bunk and I did something I had not done in a field assignment in 22 years. I opened a personal channel, not the core frequency, not the Union network, but my private family channel, and I recorded a message to my wife and my 3 children. Back home, I did not explain what I had been seeing. I did not talk about the war. I simply told them that I was thinking about them, that I wanted them to know it, and that I hoped the evening at home was a good one. I sent it before I could change my mind. I told myself later that it was a lapse in professional conduct. I told myself it was the stress of an unusually intense assignment. Both of these things were partially true, but the deeper truth, the one I did not fully admit to myself until much later, was that Petra had been right. Paying attention to the people next to you keeps the thing behind your eyes from going flat. And for 3 weeks, the people next to me had been humans, and whether I had intended it or not, I had started paying attention. There was a moment in the 3rd week that I think about more than any other single thing from that assignment, more than any tactical event, more than any clever improvisation or act of Stubborn courage. It was an ordinary evening in the factory district, a quiet hour before the overnight watch rotated. I was writing notes near the entrance to one of the basement shelters when I heard singing coming from inside. I went to the doorway and looked in. A group of 9 soldiers was gathered around a small low-light source in the center of the room. On a flat piece of scrap material there was a small snack cake, the kind that comes in pressed foil packaging and tastes, I am told, of something only distantly related to actual food. Into the top of it someone had pressed a single short length of wire that had been bent and was glowing faintly at the tip from a small electrical connection. It was a birthday light for Nina Webb, the corporal whose birthday I had noted on my first night, who had apparently been too busy surviving to celebrate on the actual day, and whose squad had been saving this moment for a week. They sang the birthday song, all 9 of them, quietly enough not to give away their position, off-key in the particular way humans are always off-key when they sing together, which seems to be a feature rather than a problem. Nina Webb laughed. When they finished, she laughed with her whole face in the way humans do when something goes directly to the part of them that is still capable of being surprised by kindness. She covered her face with her hands and shook her head and said, "You absolute idiots," with so much warmth that the word meant the opposite of what it said. She blew out the glowing wire tip. They shared the snack cake in 9 pieces that were not remotely equal in size, and no one cared. And I stood in the doorway for a long moment after the singing had stopped and the light had gone back to practical levels and they had settled into the comfortable, easy quiet of people who know each other well enough. That silence between them does not need to be filled. I wrote nothing in my log. That night I could not find the right words. I still am not entirely sure I have them. What I know is this: I have stood in the aftermath of battles that decided the fate of species. I have documented events that changed the course of history. And standing in that doorway watching 9 tired, scraped together soldiers share an inadequate snack cake in a basement, while a war pressed down on the building above their heads was, without question, the most extraordinary thing I had ever witnessed in my professional life. The next morning the Keth pushed harder. There is a specific number that I recorded with great care on the 31st day of the campaign because I wanted to be precise about it. The number was 11. 11 days since the last supply convoy had reached the Iridium Spire. 11 days of rationed ammunition, diminishing food supply, no reinforcement, no aerial support, and casualty figures that had climbed from uncomfortable to genuinely alarming by the standard models I had been using since I joined the Corps. A defending force at these numbers and under these conditions had a predicted collapse window of 36 to 48 hours. Commander Caldes received the final assessment from Union Command on the morning of day 11. I was present when the message came through. I watched her read it. The message said in the precise, neutral language that the Union used for situations like this that relief was not coming. It said that the forces being gathered for a breakout attempt had been redirected. It said that Iridium Spire's holding action had succeeded in its primary purpose, which was buying time for the larger defense network, and that the commander should use her judgment regarding next steps. Caldes read the message twice. She put Down the communication device, she stood. Very still for exactly 4 minutes. I timed it because I timed everything. In those 4 minutes she did not move. She was not composed. She did not look like a commander absorbing difficult information with professional calm. She looked like a person with the full weight of an impossible situation sitting on her chest. I watched it happen in real time. I watched her face, which is normally a controlled, deliberate thing, become briefly something else, something human in the way that word means its deepest thing. Then she stood up straight and walked back into the operations center. She did not call a meeting. She did not deliver a speech. She walked to each section of the building quietly, and she told each group of soldiers what the message had said, all of it. No softening. When Owen, the agricultural technician who ran second squad, asked her directly what the plan was, she said, "We hold what we have. That's the plan." And Owen nodded and said, "Right." Then and went back to his position. I watched this happen and I thought, this is not rational. This is not the behavior of organisms correctly processing a threat assessment. And then I thought, but it is working. Keith launched their concentrated push on the 32nd day. It was unlike anything in the previous weeks. This was not probing or pressure or sustained suppression designed to produce gradual collapse. This was a final push, a committed assault from 3 directions, the kind that the Keith reserved for the last stage of an engagement, when they have decided the calculation is complete and it is time to end the equation. The human defense held for 11 hours. I need to say that plainly because the number matters. 11 hours against a force 3 times their remaining strength, with half their original ammunition, in a structure that had been hit enough times that certain parts of it were no longer entirely there. In the 5th hour something happened that I have written about many times and still cannot entirely put into words. Soldier named Danny, who was positioned in the eastern corridor, reached a point where his body and his mind were simply done. I could see it from where I was positioned. I have seen it before in other wars, other species. It is not a failure. It is the honest result of being human, or being anything really, and being asked to absorb more than a mind was designed to hold in a single stretch of time. He sat down against the wall and he could not stop shaking, and the sound that came out of him was not a battle sound at all. It was the sound of someone who had used everything up. Caldy's was nearby. She had been everywhere that day, present at every section, moving the whole time. When she saw Danny, she did not call for a medic. She did not issue an order. She walked over to him and she sat down on the floor beside him, right there in the corridor, with everything happening around them, and she put her hand on his shoulder and she stayed. She said nothing. She just stayed. After a time, Danny's shaking became less. His breathing steadied. He looked at her and she looked back. And whatever passed between them in that look was something I could not document with numbers. He picked up his rifle and he went back to his position. Caldy's stood, brushed dust from her sleeve, and continued moving. I do not know what they Keith expected to find when they breached the main approach in the 7th hour. I know what they found. They found every remaining human soldier standing, not positioned advantageously, not safely, standing in the places they needed to be, doing what needed doing with Whatever they had left the fighting in those hours was close and brutal, and I will not describe the details because this story does not need them. What it needs is the truth, which is that the humans took every blow the Kaith delivered and they stayed standing, and after 11 hours, when the Kaith formation commanders ran the numbers and arrived at their conclusion, the Kaith pulled back. They have never retreated from a position they considered strategically necessary. In their entire history, this was recorded as a deviation from doctrine. Their commanders would later file it under what translates roughly as irrational defender effect, a documented but rare phenomenon in which a defending force's behavior falls so far outside predicted parameters that the cost models cease to produce reliable output. What that means in plain language is that the humans confused the math. The Kaith could not calculate whether continuing would cost them more than winning was worth, because the humans were doing things the model said they would not do and continuing to do them past the point where the model said they would stop. So they left. The sound the humans made when the Kaith formation disengaged was one I had never heard before in 19 wars. It was not a victory shout. It was not triumphant. It was something older and rougher and more honest than that. It was the sound of people who had gone somewhere very dark and come back, and the sound they made was simply the confirmation that they were still there, still breathing, still present. Some of them sat down immediately and put their heads in their hands. Some of them held each other, the kind of holding that does not need any words to justify it. Fiona found a section of wall and leaned against it and closed her eyes. De Jong, who had been fighting for 11 hours on a body that should not have been fighting at all, sat down on an ammunition case and looked at the ceiling for a long time with an expression that I also describe as quiet. Lena, the medic, was already moving. I stood in the doorway of the operations center with my recorder in my hand, and I did not press record. I just watched. There would be time for documentation. There would be time for reports and assessments and the proper processing of what had occurred. There would be time for all of it. For right now, in this moment, I did not want to be the person observing. I just wanted to be present for it, to witness it the way Petra had said you witness the thing behind a person's eyes that tells you they are still there. They were all still there. I did not understand how. I had watched every hour of it, and I still did not fully understand how, but they were there in that battered, half-standing building at the edge of a war that should have ended them. And every single one of them was still there. I submitted my official report to the Galactic Union War Documentation Corps on the 42nd day after my extraction from the Vasquez system. It was 340 pages long, including appendices. I had never filed a report of that length before. My previous record was 212 pages for the fall of the Sereth Empire, which involved 6 species, 4 governments, and a weapon system that the Union had subsequently classified and removed from all public records. The Senior Council reviewed my preliminary summary within 48 hours and requested a full briefing. I traveled to Union headquarters on Murith Prime and stood in the hall where I had stood after previous assignments, in front of the same panel of senior observers who had received my previous reports, and I told them what I had seen. The first question from Council member Irath was, Straightforward, what is your threat? Classification for humanity, I had. Prepared for this question, I had. Prepared for all of the questions, I said Tier 4. The room was quiet for a moment. Tier 4 is the highest designation in the Union classification system. Before this report, only 2 species in recorded history had ever received it. The Keth were one of them. Councilmember Arith said, on what basis? Their technology index is at best middling. Their numbers are not exceptional. Their tactical doctrine is improvised to the point of being barely systematic. I said, yes, that is correct on all 3 points. Then what justifies Tier 4? I opened my documentation case and I placed on the table in front of them a single sheet. Not a data file, not a summary, but a handwritten page, something I had written the night after the Iridium Spire siege ended, in a small room in the field base with the lights still on and the sounds of the base still moving. Outside the door, I said, the Keth classification system has a concept called an anthratic entity. It appears in very early Keth philosophical texts and was largely abandoned as a category because in 4,000 years of recorded conflict, the Corps has never encountered a qualifying case. The term translates loosely as that which refuses the logic of cost. Irith looked at the paper. You're saying humanity qualifies? I'm saying that on 11 separate documented occasions during this campaign, groups of human soldiers continued to function and fight past the point at which any cost-benefit analysis would have predicted cessation, not once, not as a statistical outlier, as a pattern, as I believe a fundamental feature of how they operate. All species show occasional examples of individuals pushing past rational limits, said another council member, a careful woman named Voss, who handled biological assessment, adrenaline responses, crisis behavior, survival instinct, overriding calculated withdrawal. Yes, I said, but that is not what this is. I picked up my own copy of the handwritten page. What I observed was not individuals exceeding their limits in isolation. It was a collective behavior. They exceeded their limits together, and they did it specifically because of each other, not despite their connections to one another, but because of them. Soldier who charged the Keth forward squad did it because he could not leave the people behind him exposed. The commander who sat on the floor next to a soldier who had gone dark was not managing a resource. She was refusing to let someone go alone into a bad place. Every act of continuation I recorded had at its root the same mechanism. They would not stop because someone they cared about was still going. I paused. The room was very still. I've covered 19 wars, I said. I have documented species who fought for territory, for ideology, for genetic survival, for religion, just conviction, for resources, for pride. I have seen every motivating factor in the Union's taxonomy of conflict. What I observed in the human campaign does not appear in that taxonomy. It requires a new entry, Arath said. They fight because things matter to them, I said, not abstract things, not strategic objectives or territorial calculations, specific things. The person next to them, the nephew they have never taught to ride a bicycle but plan to, the corporal whose birthday they remembered even when the world was ending. Those specific, small, irreplaceable things are what they will not walk away from, and because those Things are not subject to cost analysis. The cost analysis cannot predict them. The Caith's entire military doctrine rests on a model that assumes defenders will eventually decide the cost of continuing is too high with humans. That calculation fails because their primary motivation cannot be costed. The council sat with this for a while. Vass said, "You're describing an emotional mechanism, yes, and you believe in. Emotional mechanism is what earns them a Tier 4 designation. I believe in. Emotional mechanism is why they held a position for 11 days with no resupply at casualty rates that should have produced collapse against a force 3 times their strength and did not collapse. I believe it is why the Caith, who have never retreated from a strategically necessary position in their entire recorded history, did so, and I believe that if the Union is attempting to assess what humanity means for the future of this region of space, the starting point cannot be their technology index or their troop numbers. It has to be this." The formal session went on for another 4 hours. There were many more questions. There was significant pushback from the Military Assessment Division, which found my report methodology unusual in several places and which took particular issue with my personal addendum. The personal addendum was 12 pages. I had filed it under my own designation, marked non-redactable, against the explicit advice of my Corps liaison, who told me it was professionally inappropriate and would affect my standing with the senior council. I told her I understood that, and I was filing it anyway. In the addendum, I wrote about Dai Jiang, about the way he offered me a helmet without making a production of it, without any ceremony. The way you give something to a person because they need it. I wrote about Owen and his map drawn on a food container, and his calm, agricultural way of explaining things that should have been frightening. I wrote about Calvin, who stopped for people who dropped their groceries and whose nephews were 6 and 8, and who he thought about every quiet moment he was given. I wrote about Fiona talking about Derek and the way he folded his ration packaging and the way she laughed even though she was crying, and the way the people around her laughed too, because the only right response to that kind of memory is to hold it together. I wrote about the birthday party in the basement. I wrote about the glowing wire tip and the off-key singing and the word idiots used as a term of deep affection. I wrote about 9 unequal pieces of a terrible snack cake shared without complaint in a basement while a war pressed down from above. I wrote about Caldor sitting on the floor next to Danny in the corridor during the worst hours of the worst day. I wrote that I had seen 19 wars, and I had never seen anything like it, not because it was dramatic or because it changed the tactical picture in any meaningful way, but because of what it was at its core. It was a person choosing to be present for another person who was having the hardest moment of their life, and that choice was made in a building under assault during an 11-hour siege with no reinforcement coming, and it was made without hesitation. The council members read the addendum in silence during a break in the formal session. When we reconvened, Erath looked at me for a moment before speaking and then said, "This is outside the scope of standard documentation." I said, "Yes, it will not be included in the official report." I said, "It will be in my permanent file, which is my right under Corps documentation law, and I want to say for the official record of this session that I believe the union standard documentation framework is insufficient. For the subject, I am not recommending it be changed for other species. I am saying that humanity requires a different approach because they cannot be correctly understood from a distance. The distance is the problem. There was a long pause, then Voss said quietly, "You were affected by the assignment." I said, "Yes, I was." There was another pause. Erath looked down at the papers. In front of him, he said, "The council will deliberate on the classification questions and on the question of the union's formal posture toward humanity. Your report will be the primary document of record," he said it the way it always goes at the end of these sessions, the correct procedural phrasing, the closing of the official chapter. But then he did something that none of the council members had ever done at the end of any of my previous briefings. He looked at me, not at my documentation, not at the table, but directly at me, and he said, "Thank you for this, Forthus, not for the report for this." I flew home the next day. My wife met me at the transit terminal. She said nothing for a long moment, just looked at me, and then she said, "You're different." I said, "Yes." She asked if I was all right. I said, "Yes" to that too, and it was true, but it was true in a way that was different from how it had been true before. It was true in the way things are true when you have been somewhere that changed the shape of something inside you, and you know you will not get the old shape back, and you find you do not want it. I went back to my desk 2 weeks later, and I opened a new document, not a union report, a personal one. I started it without a title, just a blank page, and the cursor. I wrote, "The Keth have fought 10,000 species across 4,000 years. In all that time, in all those conflicts, they retreated from exactly one of them. That is the first thing the union needs to understand about humanity. That is the only thing that needs to be said, really. Everything else follows from that." I sat back and read what I had written. Then I opened the small field notebook I had carried for the entire campaign, the one with the battered cover and the coffee stain on the inside front page. I turned to the last entry, written in the dark and in a hurry during the worst night of the Iridium Spire siege, when the sounds outside were loudest, and I was sitting in a corridor with my notebook because I needed something to do with my hands. The entry said, "They are not like us. Thank every God we have." For that, I closed the notebook. I kept it on my desk where I could see it. I still have it there. I look at it sometimes when I am working on other assignments, other conflicts, other clean reports for other wars, and I think about what it means to be something that refuses the logic of cost, to love something so specifically and so stubbornly that no calculation can account for it, to sit on the floor next to someone in the dark and stay, to remember a birthday in a basement, to hand a helmet to a stranger without making anything of it, to do the next thing. Every time I look at that notebook, I think they are not like us, and every time without fail I am grateful.